at booktv.org. Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're joined now by Democratic Representative Brad Sherman of California. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, also Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets. He's the ranking member. Congressman Sherman, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Well, you don't have a Speaker of the House. Is there a role that you see Democrats playing in that?
I think Republicans will fail to elect a Speaker for several days, and then we can learn something from what's happening in Israel at a time of crisis. And we don't have just one crisis. We had a Middle East crisis, a Ukraine crisis, keep the government open crisis. Israel is forming a unity government. We ought to have a unity speakership. And whether maybe you'd like to serve as Speaker, maybe President George W. Bush, somebody, but much more important than the name of whoever would be the unity speaker, is that we need equal representation on the Rules Committee. We need bills brought to the floor that reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of both parties. Otherwise, there'll be 4 or 5 of the craziest of the crazy Republicans controlling an important branch of government.
I mean, do you think that that's possible? I mean, could there be power sharing among Democrats and Republicans given the polarization?
As Winston Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all the other alternatives. I think it will take many weeks, and then at some point, Republicans will realize that governing from the fringe and trying to satisfy that last craziest member, you can satisfy hundreds of members if you just agree that this is an evenly split House, and we ought to have an even split in how decisions are made. The Israelis can do it. And by the way, you think Democrats and Republicans don't get along? Folks in this unity government, Israel, make Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy seem like dancing partners.
Well, let's talk about that issue. Your reaction to the attack last weekend.
Horrific. The beginning of what will be a long war and a terrible war. But Hamas has been very clear. They want to kill or expel every Israeli from the Middle East. And that is their position. I'd like to see peace, but you can't make peace if the people on the other side say, I want to kill you, your family, and everybody you know. That's my position. For many years, Israel has tolerated Hamas. I don't think they can anymore.
Well, I want to show you a clip and then get your response. Yesterday on this program, Republican Representative John Bacon was was very critical of the Biden administration's response to Iran and Hamas and what he thinks. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee. Take a look.
Iran's behind us. We should be very clear. You know, the administration was wrong on multiple times now. They said they're not sure what Iran's role was. It's clear that Iran armed the Hamas and helped them for over a year plan this operation. Iran's very connected to Hezbollah up in the northern part of Israel, you know, in southern Lebanon and southwestern Syria. And so I anticipate the Hezbollah being involved or being activated to help out Hamas on this. I think the Prime Minister of Israel will sit back and say, you know, Iran's behind this whole thing. I would not be surprised to see Israel do something to Iran because in the end, Iran organized and made this possible. Over 1,000 Israelis now have been killed. I don't think Israel can ignore it.
Representative Sherman, your response to that?
Well, first, there's this effort to create political division over the slightest details. Iran has always supported Hamas. Iran is the source of 70% of their military funding. Islamic Jihad is the baby brother of Hamas, also participated in all of this. They get perhaps 100% of their funding from Iran. Everybody knows that. What there's some disagreement with is the degree to which the Iranians were involved in operational planning. Morally, that hardly matters at all. This was done consistent with Iranian objectives. It was applauded by Iran, and whether elements of the Revolutionary Guard Corps were involved in, spying on, Sderot or this or that Israeli town is a moral irrelevancy. We see in Israel at a time of crisis people unifying, and we see here partisan bickering that is unnecessary and is harmful.
And the New York Times is reporting that senior Iranian intelligence officials were taken by surprise by this attack. And but as you said, they did applaud it.
Nobody is surprised that Hamas works every day with Iranian funding to kill as many Israelis as they can. What surprised, I think, even Hamas is the degree to which is they're not surprised by the size of this, but they were more successful than anybody would have imagined. And the exact day, the exact scope, the fact that hang gliders would be used, maybe the Iranians knew that, maybe it didn't. But if you give somebody a gun and you tell them to go kill innocent people, the fact that you don't know they're going to do it on Tuesday is a moral irrelevancy.
I want to ask you about funding. Given your background in crypto, here's the Wall Street Journal headline: Hamas militants behind Israel attack raised millions in crypto. Digital currency transactions highlight how U.S. and Israel have struggled to sever the access of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah to foreign funding.
I think people don't understand how important the dollar, our role in international finance, is to American power and to the protection of our allies and our own people. There's a tendency, you think of American power, you think of an aircraft carrier group, and I'm glad we're deploying one in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the role of the American dollar and our ability to see major transactions, our ability to stop major transactions, is because of this role and because of the role we play in the traditional banking system. The advocates for cryptocurrency have told us what they want. I mean, Hamas, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them. Hamas tells you they want to kill as many Jews as we can, believe them. The supporters of cryptocurrency put right in their name: we want to create hidden money. That's what cryptocurrency means. And we want to eliminate America's ability to observe and prevent nefarious activities.
So what can the Congress do to stop that flow of funding to Hamas?
What you do is you pull the plug on crypto. If no American is allowed to legally buy crypto, crypto will drop off the face of the earth. And then we will have the kind of power that allowed us under the Obama administration to tell Iran how much oil they could sell and to which countries. We had that power not because of the aircraft carrier groups, but because of the role the New York Fed plays in international transactions. And if you look at what the crypto bros say, they are trying to destroy that power. They are what I call patriotic anarchists. They wear the American flag. They're trying to destroy American power.
I'm going to invite our viewers to join the conversation. You can do so on our lines that are open now: 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. I want to ask you, before we take calls, about Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, your colleague in the House. She said this, and I'll ask for your response: the failure to recognize the violent reality of living under siege, occupation, and apartheid makes no one safer. No person, no child anywhere should have to suffer or live in fear of violence. We cannot ignore the humanity in each other.
Hamas ignores that humanity every day. The Palestinian people have lived under Hamas oppression in Gaza for decades. They suffer from that oppression every day. Gaza would be perhaps as vibrant as Singapore if it wasn't for Hamas and their absolute unflagging dedication to kill 7 million Jews. Now, as to the partisanship of this, Vice President Pence said it right just a day after this all began when he said, this is what happens when Republican leaders try to take America off the world stage. And when the major event that occurred relevant to the Middle East immediately prior to these attacks was 198 Republicans voted for a 30% cut in America's traditional aid to Israel. That's 198 Republicans. Rashida Tlaib is one Democrat.
Let's talk to callers now. First up is Marcia in Mount Rainier, Maryland, independent. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I am a black straight woman. I believe that the Israeli-Ukraine wars are about foreign white men acting like babies. This is not a black war, but it's a Jewish war. Where are the Carters who can make peace? Thank you.
I think we all want peace, and the male half of the human race has been involved in a lot of decision-making over the last several thousand years, and it is a bloody history of our species. So I'm glad that we have an all-time high representation of women in our own decision-making process. Over 100 years ago, the suffragettes said that, however, that if women had the vote, that we would then reach peace around the world. And so far, neither men by themselves or men working with women have quite achieved that.
On the Republican line, Bessemer City, North Carolina. Mike, you're on with Congressman Brad Sherman.
Good morning, and good morning, Mr. Sherman. A couple points, if you allow me. First, I'm glad to hear you say about Rashida Tlaib, but I know there's a lot of Jewish House members, Schiff and Goldman. Goldman was in Israel when this attack happened. And all of y'all will condemn and call me and other people like me MAGA Trump supporters, MAGA extremists, but you don't have the audacity to call out AOC, Omar as terrorist extremists. And you serve in the United States Congress, right?
Yes,
the United States Congress should only have American flags in there. That's just like somebody from Georgia or Mississippi coming in and hanging a Confederate flag on there when they see that Palestine flag. Okay, and another point.
If I can interrupt.
Yep.
Quite a number of my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, have lapel pins that I've seen them around for the last year. Ukraine, the Ukrainian flag and the American flag together. I've worn that pin on occasion. I've worn the crossed flags of the United States and South Korea and the crossed flags of Israel and the United States. I've worn it on the House floor, and so have hundreds of Democrats and Republicans. So we have allies. We stand by our allies, and we exemplify that with flags right there on our lapels.
Let's talk to Jay next in Arlington, Virginia, independent. Hi, Jay.
Good morning. Fan listeners, and thank you for your program, and welcome, Congressman. My question for you is, while what happened the other day was completely abhorrent and absolutely has no room in civilized society, my question for you is why you just never, ever hear any kind of calling out of the Israeli side. I mean, to be internationally recognized to be in breach of international laws and occupying power, and to not even acknowledge of the fact that you have two completely separate, blatantly unequal systems of operation, funded mostly by our tax dollars, just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's people looking at this where any other rational coverage will let you know that this is just not acceptable. It cannot happen. It is not sustainable. It is dangerous for world peace and even our own peace here in the United States. My question for you, sir, is are you able to at least acknowledge that there is a breach of international law and that we are not a mutual arbiter to try to bring peace to these warring parties?
What do you say, Congressman?
Well, there is clearly a breach of international law when 1,000 Israeli civilians are massacred and raped, and there are reports of beheadings, killed just because they're Jewish. As to this conflict, obviously the Middle East conflict endangers the world, it endangers the United States. It's terrible for the Palestinians. It's terrible for the Israelis. The solution is a two-state solution. Hamas's position is that they will kill anybody they can who supports a two-state solution, and they've done their best the last few days. The idea that Israel should simply let Hamas continue to have this monster on their border, regrouping and doing this again in 2 or 3 months is not workable.
What about what the caller talked about as far as international law goes and holding Israel to account as an occupying power?
Well, Israel shouldn't be an occupying power. Israel should be living next to a Palestinian state. This is the most benign occupation of a hostile, of the other side, that I know of in history. It's hard to, but occupation is bad. And the solution is a two-state solution. Israel was willing back 20 years ago and longer to give the Palestinians more than anybody thinks they'd get in today's negotiations. Arafat turned it down. Israel in 1947, 1948 accepted a partition plan, a two-state solution that would be roughly half the size of Israel today in terms of populated areas. So it's Israel keeps asking for a two-state solution. And whether it is the attack in 1967 or the attack of last week and this week, that's what happens. As to international law, America has been very plain that all of our weapons are given on the condition that Israel uses them consistent with the rule of law. And no country, I think, exceeds Israel in its efforts to make sure that its weapons don't kill civilians. Now, that's a very difficult and never successful effort. You look at our bombings in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in World War II, even if you're trying to hit only military targets, but then Hamas makes that much worse by using human shields, by having their arms depots in mosques and in schools. So when you I'm the author of bipartisan legislation focused on this human shields issue. But when you add the difficulties of war, which never go exactly the way you plan, and human shields, you have civilian casualties that you try to avoid. And the rule of the law of war doesn't say there can never be a civilian casualty. It sets forth efforts that you make to try to avoid it. I think the U.S. and Israel are in the very forefront of doing that. Compare that to other nations waging war in the last 50 years.
Bradley in Marietta, Georgia, Democrats line. Good morning.
Yes, my understanding is that Hamas is a Sunni terrorist organization. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Could you? I'm going to hang up after this, but could you explain to me why it is out of the realm of possibility that right-wing elements in Israel and Saudi Arabia, who is also Sunni, who also was responsible for 9/11, wouldn't conspire to do this so Netanyahu could control power and that we can get dragged into a war and have us fight Iran for Saudi Arabia and Israel? I think it's very plausible. Thank you.
I think that's basically crazy if you've ever dealt with government. I've dealt with government for 30 years. When you do anything in government that any of the people who know about it strongly disagree with, it leaks. So how you would ever put together a group of thousands of Israelis, and not one of them would disagree with raping and killing 1,000 and more Israeli civilians, you can't get 3 Israelis to agree on what kind of hummus. You're certainly not going to get thousands of armed Israelis to agree to rape and murder their own people. That's you heard the same stories about 9/11, and that was slightly less insane in that there were only roughly 20 hijackers involved. This involved thousands of people, but there is simply no way that 9/11 could have been an inside job, that this attack could be an inside job, simply because, if people want to know what Biden had for breakfast, that would leak out too.
Let's talk to Larry next in Southport, North Carolina, Independent line. Larry?
Yes, ma'am. It's about Israel and Hamas. Hamas are basically cowards. They hide within the Palestinians, and the Palestinians should be responsible enough to throw them out of their country, but they won't. And Israel has the right to attack any target in Gaza because the Hamas doesn't care who he kills or anything, and it's backed by Iran. And the Biden administration, the soft attitude they have toward Iran has caused a lot of this problems in Ukraine and the Middle East. And that boatload of money that Obama sent Iran over billions of dollars, and what in the world did the Democrat Party think they were going to do with that?
Congressman?
There was a lot there. I agree with the caller that Israel has the right to hit any target, but I would say any military target in Gaza. As to the discussion of money, there is $6 billion that was transferred from a South Korean bank to a bank in Qatar, but not a single penny of that money has been spent.
Should that be taken back, as some Republicans have called?
If you show me a way to take it back, I think we should, because we transferred that money in part because it was their money. Yeah, they sold the oil to South Korea, but in part we allowed that transfer to get our hostages back, and no one should ever have to pay for hostages. And if you pay for hostages and you can take it back, you certainly should. But
are you saying there's no way of retransferring that money?
I would be very surprised, and I have not seen the documents, but I would be very surprised. Let's put it like this. If there was an Iranian lawyer who negotiated a deal in which we could just give them the money, let them have the money, and then take it back to South Korea and lock it up again, that Iranian lawyer will be subject to whipping and perhaps execution, because that's a level of legal malpractice so one can't imagine. I haven't seen the documents, but I can't imagine that the Iranians turned over their hostages that they were holding, Americans who, thank God, are back. And democracies always overpay for the hostages, shouldn't pay anything at all. But democracies are very vulnerable when their people are held hostage. And somebody who's a real a practitioner of foreign policy has to wince when you see what Trump did for our hostages from the Taliban and others who were in Oman, and what the Israeli government has done. In one case, trading 1,000 terrorists for one Israeli soldier. It's very difficult for a democracy not to do an awful lot to get a hostage back. That being said, I am absolutely for anything that would take the money back, and if that gets an Iranian lawyer in trouble, that's even better.
Suhail is in Laverne, California, line for Democrats. Good morning.
To ask Mr. Sherman and the United States government and Mr. Biden, how many Palestinian lives, in your opinion, sir, is equal to one Jewish life? 1, 2, 4, 10, 100, 1,000? You're sitting there talking about Israeli lives. You never mentioned one Palestinian life.
I think I did, sir. So let me, as I said, Hamas's oppression of the Palestinians in Gaza has hurt life in Gaza and led to more deaths in Gaza, perhaps than all of those who were killed in this last week in Israel. There is not a ratio of civilian lives of one nationality or religion or another, but there is a difference between a Hamas that says we delight in killing babies, and whenever we can kill another one, that's a plus. And an Israeli military that sits there and says, well, we'll hit this building this way, but we won't hit that target, will endanger lives of Israeli soldiers to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. An Israeli government that warns, that does warning leaflets to say we're going to bomb this target. That's not effective military action. No general would recommend that. But that's what Israel does to avoid civilian casualties. I don't know of any other country that does that.
And we are out of time, Congressman. There's so much more to say, but I want to thank you so much for being on the program. Representative Brad Sherman, a Democrat of California and member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all the time that we've got. Thank you for everybody that called in. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7